I'm Lawrence Francis, host of Interpreting Wine, welcoming you to the Margaret River Winemaker special series. Across these 4 episodes, recorded in February 2023, we'll be exploring the modern Margaret River winemaker scene in the company of 4 respected producers, giving you the most up-to-date exploration of the region available anywhere in podcast format. Make sure you're subscribed to be alerted when new episodes go live. We continue the series today in the company of Glenn Goodall of Xanadu Wines. We hear Glenn's origin story and he introduces us to the people at Xanadu, bringing in procedure changes they've adopted from temporary vintage staff. We take a deep dive into fruit sourcing at Xanadu before talking Margaret River native trees and soil, viticulture in Margaret River, sustainable wine growing Australia, and the premiumisation of Australian wine. Enjoy.
G'day, my name's Glenn Goodall. I'm the senior winemaker here at Xanadu Wines in Margaret River, Western Australia. I've been at Xanadu for just over 23 years now, so it's it's a labour of love. You get less for murder, actually. It's been a great part of my career, my time at Xanadu Wines, seeing the winery grow from a small family-owned winery through a publicly listed phase and back to a family-owned entity as it is now. But I think what's key with respect to any industry, but certainly in the wine industry, is having it's made by people, and it's the people that really are key to all the great wines. And I've been very fortunate to have had some amazing mentors over the journey. I think my journey started out in Port Macquarie, New South Wales. I was just looking for work, and I ended up planting vines in a vineyard. And the winemaker there recognised a young Kiwi fellow at the time. I was about 19 years old. Thought he had a pretty good work ethic and put me into the winery for vintage. And I just love the smell of the winery, the camaraderie of the people during harvest. And 6 months later, I found myself in Bordeaux. And from then on, I've never really looked back with respect to my winemaking journey. But as I said, over that journey, I've had some amazing mentors, both, like people like Drew Noon and John Cassegrain at Cassegrain Wines in Port Macquarie, Walter Finlayson in South Africa, and many other people along the way that, have been just really generous with their knowledge and their time. But coming back to that people thing, it's those sort of mentors and those people that have helped me with my career. Hopefully I can pass that on to people who work with me and for me, but also I think having really great relationships with people at every stage of the winemaking game is really what is the strength of making good wines. If you've got really good relationships, not just with your staff and your mentors and your employers, but also your suppliers and your growers and everyone, then people really buy into what you're trying to achieve rather than just being, like grape growers or grape selling in fruit. They're wine growers and they're actually invested in what you're trying to do. So I think that's the key for me, is just trying to get everybody on the same journey and invested in what you're trying to achieve when it comes to making some really good wines.
Very cool. And I think what would be great would be to actually, start to, I guess, introduce us to the team there. Who are those people around you that are helping you as you move to make great wine and grow grapefruit?
Sure. Well, I've in the winery, I've got people like Steve Kime, who's assistant winemaker here. He's been with me for 22 of those 23 years. Matt Godfrey, who's winemaker here, who I've had a long relationship over the journey. Of course, our own viticulturalist, Rob Underdown, who's been with us for a few years now, and making sure that you have a really good relationship with someone who's growing the fruit. Not just Rob, but I could rattle off 20 growers who have been growing fruit for Xanadu over the last 20 years, who are integral to our success with our wines, because they're invested in what we're doing, but also just even it's at the start of harvest now. We're not harvesting yet. We've probably got another 2 weeks, maybe 3 weeks to go. But it's really lovely at this time of the year when you get all of the interns that come in, which is a fresh, cohort of people every vintage from all over the world, with the exception of COVID. We're closed borders here in Western Australia, but who are able to come and not just, they're coming here to learn, but 9 times out of 10, they teach as much as they learn, and you're actually picking up some really great insights from their part of the world or where they've worked in the past. So I think that's also, even though it might only be a fleeting sort of period that they're here over the journey, like for 2 or 3 months, they all have a great impact on what we're able to achieve.
I love it. And it's, as you say, that I love that kind of two-way process as well. And it actually came up quite recently. I was interviewing a number of winemakers over in New York's Finger Lakes region. And because they're Northern Hemisphere, and just because they were, slightly mad and keen to learn, they were then able to mix and match and do the Southern Hemisphere harvest and do their own harvest as well and accelerate that learning. So, it's, as you say, it's great for both sides of the equation, isn't it?
Oh, totally. And certainly in the early part of my career, prior to having kids, it was, and a lot of young winemakers become vintage specialists where you can go and do sometimes more than 2 vintages a year if you can manage to get somewhere in an early harvest in the Southern Hemisphere followed by a late harvest and then head up to the Northern Hemisphere. So that was me in the early part of my career where I got to work whether it was Bordeaux, US, South Africa, France, New Zealand, and Australia, and in many cases more than 2 vintages a year. It's nice to be able to settle down and see wines through from start to finish, rather than just being an expert at processing and great socially as well. But when you actually retain that really strong connection with the vineyard right through to bottling, which is certainly with being at Xanadu for 23 years, I feel is a strength when you've got that sort of relationship with not just the people but also the vineyards.
Yeah, very cool. And this is, I guess, one of those kind of rabbit holes that I'd be, very curious for you to take us down, really. In terms of really, given the location of the region and given, its kind of distance from most of the rest of the world, are there any particular examples that you can kind of point to about where people who've, as you say, been sort of more transient or maybe, passing through your winery and passing through the region, have maybe opened your eyes to doing things in a different way that maybe has stuck with you even after they've moved on, and has become a part of the way that you do things?
Yeah, I guess often it's something that comes down to simple procedures that you go, oh my God, I can't believe that's such a great way. Even simple things like cleaning bungs by putting them in a bubbling sort of water washer rather than scrubbing them by hand, or sometimes stylistically where people are introducing a lot more whole bunch ferment or into reds in particular, which is something that we never really dabbled with a lot here, but in recent years have taken on a bit more of that with some of our Shiraz wines as well. I think one of the things that I find most interesting when you're talking to people from overseas is, which is hard, it's not as tangible as in the winery, because in the winery you can actually look at those procedural changes, but it's when you start to talk to them about what they're doing in the vineyards, and sometimes that comes with a lot more experience, but also first-hand experience where people have had the opportunity to whether they've dealt with different rootstocks or whether they've dealt with high summer rainfall or which is not necessarily a Margaret River thing, but rootstocks, for example, is something that we're still learning about over here in Margaret River.
Very cool. So, and it sounds as though that's still an ongoing process. You're still, as vintages come around, you're kind of open to hearing from people who are interested in kind of visiting and doing vintages there?
Oh, totally, yeah. Look, I've got a young fella here from Champagne who's, I don't know that he's ever seen a Cabernet grape in his life, but we make a small amount of bubbly. It's very niche and it's only for Celador, but I'm just looking forward to tapping his brain on what they do over there in Champagne. So, yeah, there's always opportunity with different people that come through every year.
Okay. Very cool, very cool, and I love this. Yeah, it's really giving me a strong insight to you, I think, and I guess the culture really there that you've got at Xanadu. And I think what would be a great kind of contrast to that is to actually start to take us into the vineyards themselves, really, and start to kind of show us where that fruit is coming from. I mean, maybe so that we, you take us along on that journey is to maybe talk a bit to, what percentage is kind of estate grown and what percentage is kind of sourced from growers. And then also, what are some of those growing sites like, indeed, contrasting between estate fruit and bought fruit as well.
Sure. Well, the Margaret River region is a reasonably large area. So it's about 100 kilometres north-south and about 30 kilometres east-west. Mm-hmm. The whole peninsula, for lack of a better word, is surrounded by the ocean to the north, the Indian Ocean to the west, and the Southern Ocean to the south. So very much a maritime, sort of Mediterranean maritime climate. And within that area, probably about 50% of our fruit comes off our own vineyards, being quite central, very close to the Margaret River township, which is relatively central within that growing area. Mm-hmm. But also having another 20-odd growers, both north and south. And so the soil types within those within the area is quite diverse. It's quite a patchwork quilt of soil types within the Margaret River region, ranging from some of those lighter, sandier soils to beautiful gravelly loams, through to heavier clay soils. So, with respect to topography and aspect, I think the highest point in the Margaret River region might be about 250 odd metres above sea level. So we don't really have any altitude anywhere, but we do have some lovely aspects with quite a few different, not just the Margaret River, but the Budgetup Creek and the Willie Abrut Brook, just different tributaries that come down through the area. So there's certainly some aspect there to have within the region as well. A large proportion of the Margaret River region is actually still national park, which is all just native trees. When you come to the area, don't expect just a monoculture of grapevines. It really is this lovely mix of native flora, vineyards, as well as farming. A farming area with mainly dairy and cattle. So when I ride, I only live 7 kilometres from work. Like the Xanadu winery and vineyard is very close to town, and I go from what is essentially, if I ride my pushy to work, I go from what comes into a rural town, through past some cows grazing on the side of the road, through some bush, then past the vineyard, and then come into the winery. So it's all of that's within 7 kilometres. So it really is quite a diverse part of the world, and also really very much a biodiversity hotspot with such a huge array of different flora in the area.
Very cool, yeah, and we'll hopefully get to hear a bit more about that when we talk about viticulture as well, because I think that's always an interesting picture to paint, isn't it? Like, what's actually there, kind of growing in between the vines. I think though, you've opened up again another area there, Glenn. Talking about the height, and it also came up in the previous interview that we're not talking about huge altitudes where you're at, and I'm just curious, what would be kind of the longer term kind of geological influences that I guess have shaped that environment, but then have meant that it isn't a high, it isn't a lot of altitude there, which we maybe do find in some other grape growing regions around the world.
Oh, I guess you're going right back to plate tectonics and all that sort of that geology there. There's Western Australia generally hasn't got any anywhere with any particular altitude. Like there's one place called Bluff Knoll down in the Parongarups, which is probably about 200 kilometres southeast of here, which might get a dusting of snow in the middle of winter, and that's about it. And that makes the front page of the West Australian when that happens. So no, it's a pretty flat part of the world over here, although we do have this lovely undulating sort of typical Western Australian sort of coastline, and you do see that the biggest influence for us is as I mentioned, being surrounded by that ocean on three sides, that very much that maritime climate. So even though we don't have the altitude, we've got this amazing moderating influence of the ocean around us, which helps. We don't really get extremes of temperature. Very rarely will we ever get a frost. Never ever will we get snow in Margaret River. And particularly in a warming climate, it's really lovely when you've got that maritime influence with, this great big air conditioner called the Indian Ocean, which arcs up at 11:30 midday every day and brings in this lovely cooling sea breeze, which has an amazing influence on all of our vineyards, particularly those late ripening varieties, so that it extends that ripening period while maintaining coolness and freshness for the Cabernets in particular.
I love it. And it's something that I've actually just seen here, which I think would be really fascinating and completely bring those two bits of the story together, is where you've started to talk about how what's above the ground naturally reflects what's below the ground. So I wonder if you wouldn't mind just taking us through, I guess, some of the examples that you've already shared with me before we started recording.
Yeah, sure. It's, as I mentioned, it's the geology is a patchwork quilt of soil types in Margaret River. There are some areas which are, the soil types are a little bit more uniform, but but they're not large in the context of the whole region. Often what you see above the ground is actually reflecting what's below the ground. So some of the best soil types for viticulture are these lovely free-draining gravelly loams, which have got this lovely sort of laterite and ironstone content in them. So we just call them these forest growth gravelly loams. And generally, the native flora for that you see in those areas are marri trees. When you get into much sort of lighter soils, the sort of sandy loams, you see another tree, a eucalypt called a jarrah tree. And then in the heavier soils, which are like clays and mungites are duplex soils where there's like sandy over, which can quickly transition to heavier clays, you'll see karri trees. All of these are sort of very much Australian bush, eucalypt genus, or in the case of marri, it's Corymbia, but they're all of that sort of eucalypt sort of family, or Myrtaceae actually. But it's you really do see that reflection, and it's a great indicator when you're driving down Caves Road, for example. You'll be going through all these marri trees, you'll come around a corner, go down, boom, straight away you'll just be in karri country. So it's a great indication of what sort of is below the ground. Particularly when it comes to viticulture, the marri tree or the red gum, Corymbia calophylla, is very important for us here because it blossoms at the same time as we have our harvest. So when we have a really good marri blossom, generally it bodes well for the harvest, because that is the food source for a lot of the birds, which can be a real pest to our viticulture. So the birds are distracted and they'll go to the native flora, which is the marri blossom, and they'll leave the grapes alone. But if you have a year when the trees don't blossom very well, it can be a lot more challenging in the vineyard. We net everything anyway, but it can be a lot more challenging when there's not a lot of marri blossom around. But it's just coincidental that the marri trees tend to grow on some lovely free draining gravelly loams, which is great viticulture country.
I love it. And, that kind of free information almost, but needing to know where to look for it. And I'm just curious, like, what was the sort of origin of that knowledge, really? Are you aware kind of how you kind of came to know make that connection between those different types of trees and what's going on underneath the soil?
I think this just comes with experience, and I think that certainly viticulturalists have known what are the better soils for over the journey. Like Margaret River's got a 50 plus year commercial history, but we've been growing grapes in the area for a lot longer than that. But really only since 1967, since Vas Felix planted the first commercial vineyards, is our wine industry officially being known. But you'd probably go back to a long time before that. Certainly the local, the Wadani people who are the traditional custodians of the area would be well aware of what soil types and what trees, although, viticulture certainly wasn't around then, given that it's all introduced species.
Yeah, I absolutely love this story. I mean, and I'm racking my brain now actually to think if it's ever actually come up on any other episodes, where, I know that I've spoken before about people who are planting new vineyards and buying new vineyard sites, and them doing, core samples and doing analysis. But that obviously takes time and, takes a fantastic amount of money as well. Whereas presumably, this is something that's free. It's like, but you've obviously got to pay attention and invest the time in understanding, I guess, what the soil and in this case, what those native trees and their state of health is kind of telling you.
Yeah, for sure. And I think it's applicable in most areas of the world, though. It would just be different species. Certainly in heavier, sort of swampier areas, you get a totally different species than you might find in lighter, sandier soils, which generally are much more drought sort of tolerant. So yeah, I can't think of any other specific varieties that come to mind right now. But yeah, I think when you look at some weeds that we have here, there's some weeds that grow much more prolifically in heavier wet soils than they do in dry soils.
Yeah, I love it. And it's just keeping your eyes open and making those connections. I think it's absolutely fascinating. And again, that's totally something that I could sort of quiz you on all day. But I want to also get into some other elements of the story there. And I think really the place where I'd encourage you to kind of move to is to talk a bit to the viticulture. You've already started talking about some of the viticultural practices there. One that I saw on the pre-interview questionnaire, which I thought was really interesting, and I think will make a kind of a nice counterbalance to that story and that insight from before, is planting the right variety clone in the right area. So I wonder if you wouldn't mind just exploring that in terms of what you're doing there and what you're seeing from the fruit.
Yeah, well, certainly those the free draining gravelly loams, which contain some lovely ironstone and so on, they tend to be perfect for most varieties, but in particular some of the reds, Cabernet, because of the fact that some of those heavier soils, which may be quite clay dominant, that those clays tend to hold on to their water holding potential is a lot higher than the free draining soils. So therefore, with late ripening varieties or vegetative varieties or herbaceous varieties such as like Cabernet, you really don't want that on those heavier, wetter soils that retain a lot of moisture. You want them to drain away well, so that they've still got enough moisture to physiologically ripen, but they also they actually stop growing, so they can actually focus so that the plants actually are focusing their photosynthesis on ripening grapes, rather than continuing to produce vegetative matter and tendrils and leaf and so on. Having said that, some of the white varieties and Chardonnay, Sauvignon Blanc, if they're on those heavier soils, they'll still grow well in those free draining soils. But notwithstanding that, most vineyards, or a lot of vineyards, or a high proportion of vineyards, have the ability to irrigate. Those heavier soils with that water holding potential you can keep a little bit more leaf on those varieties, those white varieties, keep them fresh, and you don't necessarily want to stress a lot of those varieties, whereas quite often the reds, a little bit of stress with the reds doesn't hurt with respect to, just making sure that you've got good anthocyanin, colour production, tannin ripeness, and so on. So a lot of it comes down to clearly the variety and in some cases the clone as well. Some clones respond a little bit differently to different soils and have different outcomes. Cabernet is a classic example where our heritage clone for Cabernet is the Horton clone, which tends to lose its herbaceousness and have really lovely sort of ductile tannins quite early in the piece, whereas SA126, which is a clone that was really introduced in the late 80s and through the 90s for yield, tends to have much more angular tannins and tends to hold on to its herbaceousness a bit longer, and you need to sort of hang it a little bit more. So that sort of thinking, making sure that you're putting the right variety and clone in the right areas. It's not a uniform region where one solution fits every site, and I think we're constantly learning about what's the best variety and rootstock and clone to be putting on the different soil types.
Amazing. And as this is a series, looking at the region, I wonder, are there any particular approaches that you see to viticulture that are common and kind of accepted, I guess, in Margaret River that you maybe have seen as either something kind of unique, maybe, or something a little bit different to what you might see in other regions of the world?
Margaret River, I guess, relative to a lot of other regions, block sizes are relatively small, and that's probably, I guess, in part to the boutique nature of the origins of the region here, and also the fact that there is still a lot of area that is dedicated to national park and or dairy and other industries. A lot of the regions still are relatively traditional. VSP, vertical shoot positioning, but with respect to its setup and conventional viticulture, people are embracing a little bit more of that sort of Aussie sprawl with some red varieties, which is just, again, canopy management. At the moment, I think Margaret River, about 12% of Margaret River vineyards are organic. So that's something that's certainly being looked at a little bit more, and also, sustainability. Just generally, there's a big push in Margaret River at the moment with Sustainable Winegrowing Australia, which is not necessarily dictating how vineyards are grown, but certainly having a sustainability element, which is a measurable and auditable element to not just grape growing but also the winemaking. So by and large, I think the what's happening in Margaret River is becoming a much better understanding of viticulture generally, and trying to little bits of ideas from all over the world. I think we're pretty open-minded here in Margs, in that we're quite happy to trial something, but it's got to produce the goods and actually be worthwhile before we continue with it.
Yeah, I love it, and I think you've really there opened up a really smooth connection through to talking about enology, and maybe that's an interesting starting point there. Where you're talking about you being the first winery in Western Australia to have that Sustainable Winegrowing Australia SWA trust mark, and could you maybe give us an insight into what does that sort of inform / influence in terms of the winemaking once you've got all that fruit through and into the cellar?
Yeah, so the Sustainable Winegrowing Australia it's a nationally recognised accreditation for sustainability. It's governed by Wine Australia and the Australian Wine Research Institute, all independently audited by a third party. It doesn't necessarily mean that you are making organic wine or biodynamic wine. It just means that you, at all stages through the growing of the grapes and through the viticulture, You're adhering to best practice. You're measuring that best practice, and you're making sure that you're able to demonstrate that you're improving on that year in, year out. It's certainly a bit of a groundswell which is happening in Margaret River and also in other parts of Australia to take on the Sustainable Winegrowing Australia protocols and being audited so that you're making sure that at least 85% of your fruit is certified in order for you to be able to wear that sustainability trust mark on your labels. As far as the winemaking goes, I genuinely think whether from an organic or a non-organic perspective, it doesn't matter. But the most significant decisions in the winemaking, I think, are made in the vineyard. And early on, with respect to obviously notwithstanding site selection and soil types and all that, it's how you're managing that vineyard. Picking decisions to me are absolutely paramount. It's probably the most important. 70% of the 70% of that end products of a wine, I think, is determined by that picking decision. Getting it right is really important. There's a lot of people just toying with different parts of things with various wine styles, wild fermentation. I think Chardonnay's a classic example where trends have changed in Australia or around the world over the journey, where a lot of Australian Chardonnays 20 years ago, were big, often mallowy, yellow, bold, oaky kind of styles that were very obvious and very gluggable, but sometimes pretty obvious. But because they're obvious, they got a lot of Aussie Chardonnays into people's mouths. But then, potentially it could be perceived as being a little bit one-dimensional because they're all very, very similar. So I think that pendulum has swung from that to some skinny, sort of quite really lean, austere wines that have had that have relied on a lot of sulfides and funk and everything in between. I think Margaret River's probably been a little bit immune from that because of the clone of the Chardonnay that we use, which not everybody, but our heritage clone of Chardonnay, the Gingin clone, inherently has quite a high acidity, but it's really quite generous with its flavour profile. So from that perspective, that generosity hasn't necessarily meant that you've needed to modify the acid by putting it through Malo, even though some people still do, and it's certainly very, very much a legitimate style. But I think that from a Margaret River perspective, the pendulum swung so far left and right on Chardonnay that people are getting pretty comfortable just within their own skin and just marching to their own drum beat. There's no right or wrong way to do it. I think diversity within styles of any variety, but Chardonnay is a great example because it's there's so many different interpretations of how you want to make the wine.
Yeah, I love it. It's really great to hear you discussing. I think it's that tension, isn't it, really, between, okay, this is the regional style and this is what kind of, people expect. And I guess the promise that Margaret River kind of puts on the label when people see that, but then also, having an individual brand and, an individual approach. And I think, these two things can certainly work together. I think, it's, knowing where your wine is coming from, but then also, when you want to kind of, again, go down that rabbit hole and, look at different producers, understand what they do differently to one another. I think that's all really interesting, isn't it? I think it's all kind of part of, a longer term piece, really, where you wouldn't just want to just have one Margaret River Chardonnay. You'd want to kind of try them all.
Oh, totally, yeah. And I think particularly with that Gingin clone, which characteristically has got a lot of hen and chicken or Mélarandage, where there's a lot of big berries and small berries. They're generally lower bunch weights, lots of intensity. So as I mentioned, that generosity and relatively zippy acidity is a hallmark of that. But if lots of different producers have got different house styles, I think that's great. That diversity is what will future-proof Chardonnay and other varieties. And I think from a region like Margaret River, the rising tide floats all boats. So what's good for other producers and, is great for all of us, even provided we still have that diversity at the end of the day, as long as there's still, there's different styles, but as long, there's substance with the wines, and that's more important, I think, is the substance over style.
Very cool. And as we really kind of look to closing, Glenn, I'd like to, kind of go against my my normal advice to myself, really, and actually ask a really big question, and something that I've seen you wanting to talk about and mentioning in the pre-interview work, which is really interesting, and it's that single word that you've used there, which is premiumization, and that idea of getting across that message that Australia has the ability to produce fine wines of the highest order. And I'm wondering, if you could maybe take us a little bit into that challenge, because over the years we've seen Australia producing very high volumes and very good value wines, and maybe the perception of the wider consumer is still lagging behind a little bit, and maybe needs that help to visualize and to be ready to pay those higher prices. So could you just give us a sense of that that journey, really, and where you think Margaret River is in that sense?
Yeah, so I think that's one of the challenges for us is that over the last 40 or 50 years, a lot of Australian wines have been recognised for being larger volume, sunshine in a bottle, a good value, happy-go-lucky, gluggable wines, and there's definitely a place for that in the wine world, but. One of the things with Margaret River, I think, is, that whole regional hero kind of approach is really trying to focus on the fact that this part of the world has the ability to really produce some fine wines, which I personally think they can go toe-to-toe with the best in the, Cabernets with the best of Bordeaux and Napa and other parts of the world, and Chardonnays with the best of Burgundy, and again with other parts of the world or more traditional regions for those varieties. We're in a really, really special place in Margaret River, and I think we're in a special time as well, where people are, as I mentioned before, becoming very comfortable in the skin, in that we don't necessarily need to emulate Bordeaux or to emulate Burgundy. What we've got here is really special, and it's the DNA of Margaret River, which I think is something that resonates really well in that fine wine, that premium wine market, and often at prices currently that are more than comparable with the top echelon of Cabernet and Chardonnay from more traditional producing areas around the world. So I welcome the opportunity for people who have got the inclination and the funds and the time and the opportunity to try some of the benchmark wines from Margaret River and put them into a lineup where you are benchmarking them against the best of the world, because we do that relatively regularly here at various events in Margaret River, at the Cape Mentel International Cabernet Tasting, the Cullen International Chardonnay Tasting, and lots of other tastings in between. And I think that's where the proof's in the pudding, is when you're actually looking at these wines blind relative to counterparts, often 5 times, 10 times the price. Blind tasting is a great leveler. I love it, and it's a really great opportunity to realise the potential of the quality in Margaret River at producing fine wine. Cool.
And just curious, for those people who maybe don't have the luxury and the time, as and those things that you say there to get over, and are in the UK or in the US, like a lot of my listeners. What do you think is the biggest opportunity for a Margaret River to get that message across to those people?
Oh, I think it's ongoing. There's nothing better than feet on the pavement. So the more opportunity for Margaret River winemakers and viticulturists and other people in the wine industry to get out to market, to get to the UK and to other parts of the world, to sort of spread that message, but more importantly, just to get wine in people's mouths, I think, and in an opportunity where people can taste the wine, but make their mind up for themselves. Without that's why I think that comparative tasting thing is fantastic. But it's just giving these wines the opportunity and the chance to shine alongside the world's best or in isolation. I just think people probably tend to gravitate more to more traditional areas because of reputation rather than have a look at some of the, on a global stage, Margaret River's reputation's come a long way in 50 years, and it's hopefully that's for the right reasons and that it's quality-based.
A huge thanks to today's guest, Glenn Goodall of Xanadu Wines. Do visit xanadunewines.com, where you can learn more about the project and find their main social media handles. Please help to amplify this fantastic conversation and the Margaret River Winemaker series in general by sharing the direct link, which is interpretingwine.com/502. You can also find links to all episodes from the series in the description below. And of course, I'd love to have you following along with me on social media, where I'm at Interpreting Wine on Instagram and Facebook, and at Wine Podcast on Twitter. Next time on the Interpreting Wine Margaret River Winemaker series in episode 503, I'll be speaking with Ben Gould of Blind Corner. Make sure you're subscribed to be alerted when this episode goes live. See you then.